Hey, how you guys doing? Thanks for having me. I've been trying to come to Hacktivity for about 3 years, but my schedule has never allowed it until this year, so I'm really happy to be here. Um, I'm not exactly sure uh, what a keynote is supposed to be. Um, my experience going to conferences and seeing keynotes is they're like the other talks, except the person just talks and talks and talks about nothing. So that's kind of what I was going for. Um, Basically, this talk is about, there's a conference in the United States called DEF CON, which is sort of like Hacktivity, but a little bigger. And the thing I hear there a lot is about people who say, I bring my computer and I wipe it when I'm done, and I bring my phone and I don't turn it on, and I bring a phone that isn't mine because I'm afraid to bring my phone to DEF CON, and all this stuff that I think is kind of ridiculous. So this talk is basically about mobile security and what to be scared of and what not to be scared of. All right, so who am I? I give talks a lot. I work at Twitter. I don't know, other stuff. So let's talk about smartphones. So if you read blogs or surf the web at all, you see a lot of stories about smartphone security and scary things about it. If you read Miko's blog, I'm sure there's a lot of these in it. So here's just some of them that I just pulled off the web from like pretty famous places, at least in the U.S., about smartphones. So it's like, and most of these I took at the end of 2012. So we can actually already see in the 10 months that most of these are bullshit. But so let's pretend that we don't. So anyway, smartphone cyber attacks to grow, mobile devices, the new front and threat war. CIOs must address this growing threat. Android becoming mobile malware magnet. How you can protect yourself. Mobile attacks top the list of 2013 security threats. Hackers eager. Mobile security threats rise. Top security threats in 2013. Mobile, right? Mobile is the thing that's going to bring us all down in 2013. And of course, the one that affects me in a personal level is that there's people telling me not to watch pornography on my phone. So we need to get to the bottom of this. So here's some more headlines about mobile security. So iPhone flaw lets hackers take over. Security flaw revealed in T-Mobile's Google phone. Researchers attacked my iPhone with SMS. iPhone, BlackBerry, Tumble, and Ponone contest. Near-field communication hack. Does anyone know what these all have in common? Anyone? They're all about me. So they're all attacks that I've done. So headlines are fun and flashy, but I can personally tell you that most of them are not things that are going to affect you personally. It's just things that guys like me do for fun, but like your average cyber criminal probably isn't going to pull this stuff off. So this has two points. One is you should probably listen to me because I know what I'm talking about, and two, I'm not totally against reporters and headlines. In fact, I love reporters and I love headlines, but I just think mostly they're sort of full of it. So what am I going to talk about? Attacks, how they work, why mobile attacks are different, and then I'll sort of touch on Android and iOS and how they're built, secure or not, and why that makes a difference. And then I'll talk about actual problems and then attackers, and I have actually less time for the talk than I thought, so I'll probably have to skip a little bit of this, but and then at the end I'll talk about what I think is going to change in the future. So, all right, so let's talk about just sort of in general how attacks happen, right? So whether you're talking about a computer or a phone or a toaster or whatever, like there's basically two things that can happen to your device that a bad guy can do to you. So one is that, essentially what we call malware. So you've downloaded some code and you run it. Like maybe it's not what you thought it was, or maybe it tricks you in some way, but it's code you downloaded and ran. The other way is what we sometimes call drive-by downloads, which is exploits. So these are things that You didn't intend to run anything. You were just surfing the web or reading your email, and next thing you know, there's code running, and you didn't want that to happen. That's basically it, right? And the biggest category of ways that bad guys get code running on your device, this is it. All right, so digging a little more into that. So malware is, it's just code. So it's hard for a computer or a computing device to really protect itself from that, right? Computers are stupid, they run code. It's not their job to determine what code is you want it to run and what code you don't want it to run. It doesn't know good code from bad code. Basically what we do for that is antivirus, right? Antivirus's job is to decide what code is good and what code is bad. But the computer itself doesn't really know the difference. As far as exploits go, there's a few things that you have to worry about. So exploits only happen because there's vulnerabilities in software. So you need a vulnerability in your web browser or whatever, and then you need the ability for the attacker to turn that vulnerability into running code. So that's the exploit. So you need to have a vulnerability, and then you need to be able to exploit it. So when it comes time to stop malware, I mean, there's only a few things you can really do. So you can make it hard to get the malware on there in the first place. Once that happens, you can limit what the malware can do. So like maybe it can, if you stop it from looking at your pictures, then that's good, right? After that, you can make it to where it can't stay forever. You can limit its persistence. And then finally, you can sort of look and catch it later because you see it sending all of your photos to China or whatever. So that's really your options when it comes to stopping and detecting malware. On the exploitation side, you've got a few choices. So you can make it to where there's no vulnerabilities in the software. This is really hard to do, and we don't know how to do it, and we've essentially kind of given up on this, which is a shame. The other thing that you can do is you can say, okay, there's going to be vulnerabilities, but we're going to make the exploitation part hard. And that's what as a society or whatever, we've really focused on in the last, say, 5 years, maybe 10 years. And then what we can do is say sort of the same thing as with malware, like, okay, there's a bad guy, he's running code, but we can limit what it can do. And then we can make it hard to stick around, and we can make it, we can maybe detect that the bad guy is doing something at some point. And that's basically our options for exploitation. And this is true for computers or phones or whatever. And so if you go back to my last slides and you think about what can I do as a consumer versus what can Apple or Google or someone do, it turns out that the choices are pretty limited. So the things that I have in red are things that basically you have no control over. So they're things that are controlled by the way the device is made and designed. The only thing you can really do is monitor things afterwards, on mobile phones at least. So that means we don't have much that we can do as end users to sort of protect ourselves. But as you'll see as the talk goes on, luckily, the things that were in red are actually pretty good. So we're in pretty good shape. So anyway, let's talk about why mobile is different than PCs. So did Raiders of the Lost Ark make it to this part of the world? I hope so. So anyway, so 1980s, like Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, it was a great movie. At the same time, computers were sort of, getting, everywhere. I guess I probably had a computer around 1980 or so. So anyway, the point where computers, they were built, they ran programs, like no one really cared about security. They didn't even really talk to each other. But the idea was you could get a program on a disk or whatever, put it in your computer, and it would run. There really wasn't much in the way of computer software. There weren't even, like no one was really even thinking about exploits, much less exploit mitigation. So it was a whole different world back then. If you fast forward to 2008, and I'll tell you why I chose that year in a minute, the Indiana Jones franchise was much worse. The movies were terrible at this point. But the security had improved it quite a bit. So there was, I'm glad one person likes my Indiana Jones jokes. So at this point, we were sort of building security into systems, which was great. We had, of course, antivirus everywhere. It's not perfect, but it helps in some cases. We had moved, like attackers had moved away from attacking things like browsers and had started to focus on things that were easier, like third-party plugins like Java and Flash and stuff like that. And we at least knew how to do exploit mitigations. Not everything had it, but we knew about randomizing memory and making memory not executable, stuff like that. And so the reason I chose 2008 was that was when smartphones kind of came about. So that was when the iPhone 2 came out and the first Android phone came out. And the reason that I don't include iPhone 1 is because, it's just showing how old I am, but iPhone 1s were like total pieces of crap. So there was no app store. You couldn't download programs to your phone. There was no SDK. It was basically a web browser and a camera. And Steve Jobs, in his infinite wisdom, said, if you want apps for this phone, you'll make a website that looks like an app. And when they surf to it, it'll look like it's an app. And so people were like, nah, really, I think I'd like to download apps to my phone. So when iPhone 2 came out, they included the App Store, and they built in a ton of security, not because they cared about us as consumers, but because they cared about their intellectual property, and they didn't want us to like steal all their apps and stuff. So, but it turns out that actually helped security as well. So, as a comparison, iPhone 1, your web browser ran as root. So, that, obviously is not super secure. And when I pointed this out to Apple, their comment was, well, there's only one user on this device, so who cares what it runs as? Not great. But anyway, so 2008, smartphones came out, and the reason that smartphones are, in my opinion, are more secure is because they were built in a time when we understood security. So there was less expectations, right? So when I have a computer, like if I download code, it better damn well run because that's what computers do. But my phone, it's like this new device. I don't really know what to expect. And so if you tell me I have to get my app from the App Store, okay, that seems reasonable, right? So anyway, the idea is that we learned our lesson over those years, and smartphones benefited from that. They had exploit mitigations, mostly built in, some built in. Now they're all built in. They were designed not to run apps from random places, but only from certain places. And all the apps were designed from the beginning to run in a sandbox. So it's very different than on, in PCs. And exploitation was way harder. So there's much smaller attack surface. So like on my iPhone, there's no Flash, there's no Java. Like these are huge things that almost every PC has that my phone doesn't have. There's of course a ton of exploit mitigations. And because of the whole way that sandboxes are written, you basically need more than one exploit to do anything useful, which is much harder to do. Where on the PC, we're almost there now. Most of the browsers run in sandboxes, but it's a pretty new thing. And even then, there's cases where you can get around that. So that's why mobile is different. So let's talk about like how they're different. So how iOS and Android are different kind of beasts. So in iOS, the philosophy is Apple wants to control everything. And in Android, it's more of an open environment. And the biggest difference between the two comes in code signing. So in iOS, everything has to be signed by a trusted party. And when you get the phone out of the box, the only trusted party is Apple. So your binaries have to be signed. Your libraries have to be signed. Even dynamically allocated memory has to be signed if it's going to execute. So the consequences of this are that you have to get these things from someplace where they're signed. And by default, that's the App Store. The apps can't just download new libraries and run them. That doesn't work because they're not signed. The apps can't just allocate memory, write code to it, and execute it because it's not signed. So programs can't change what they do. They have to do exactly what they're going to do. You can statically analyze them and know exactly what they'll do. Likewise, if somehow you were to download new programs to your phone, they're not signed, they won't run. And if you do somehow get them to run, if you reboot, they're not going to run because, again, they're not going to be signed. So code signing has a lot of effects on exploitation. So, on a PC, if you can break out of a sandbox if there is one and you get administrator privileges, you're golden. You're there forever. But on an iOS device, it's not the case. So in iOS, I could attack your web browser. I could break out of that sandbox. I could even elevate to root. And I'll be running as root, and I can do tons of things to your phone. But if you reboot, I'm gone. Again, that has to do with code signing, because anything I leave behind, it's not going to work when you start your phone again. I'll have to exploit you one more time. which you can do, but it's obviously more difficult. So what about the apps? So the apps, they don't run as root anymore, which is cool. They run as a low user called mobile. They run in a sandbox. And there's some things that they have to ask permission for. So like if they want to access your contacts or your photos, the user has to say okay the first time. And like I said earlier, they can't just change what they're doing or download new code or update themselves. So if you want to get an app to a person, so say I'm a bad guy and I want to get an app on your phone, I have to send it through the App Store. And part of that means I have to get an account. This account's going to cost me $99. I don't know what that is in your guys' money system. But the more scary thing is I have to somehow prove to them who I am. So I have to give them a credit card number, and there's also this mysterious thing that sometimes says that they need even more information. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it's sort of a scary thing if I'm a criminal. Then I have to send them my app, and they have to review it and okay it. And if it does get past that, they can remove it from the store later if they find out it's bad. And there's no one knows this for sure, even me. Some people think they can remotely remove apps from your phone. We don't know for sure, but it's possible that that's the case. And so the end result is that Apple essentially acts as your antivirus. They're the ones who determine what code is good and what code is bad, and they remove code that they don't think is good if it's somehow they find out later. So what about all the iOS malware out in the world? Well, there really isn't any. There's a few, but compared to, say, the PC world, it's like nothing. So if you wanted to write malware for iOS, you'd have two options. One is you could just write an app that just did something bad and hope it got through the App Store review process. And if you wanted to access the address book, you just ask the user, and a bunch of users are going to click yes, because that's what users do. They click things. The other option, if you want to be like hardcore, is you build an exploit into your app. So when it runs, it can break out of the sandbox, it can get root, it can do whatever. But here you're giving Apple exploits, which is something that I don't recommend. So this is the story of me getting kicked out of the App Store. So back a couple years ago, I found a vulnerability in the way that they do their code signing. So it allowed an app that was on your phone to download new code and run it, even though it wasn't signed. So that's a no-no. That shouldn't be possible. But I figured out a way to do it. And so I told Apple about it because I'm a good guy. And I also made an app because I just knew, because I've worked with Apple a lot in the past, and I knew what they were going to say. They were going to say, well, Charlie, that's a great bug, but if anyone ever made an app with that, we would catch it. Our review process, it's top notch. We'd never get through. And so I just knew they were going to say that, and I couldn't stand it. So what I did was I put an app into the App Store that had the vulnerability, or it had the exploit built into it, and they didn't catch it. So in fact, it got rejected once, but it was only because something really stupid, like I used the wrong font or something. But once I fixed that, then it went in fine with the exploit. So then the exploit was there. So if you got the app from the App Store and ran it, it would download like a library and load it and run it, even though it wasn't signed. And then once they found out about that, they got really mad, and they removed the app and they kicked me out of the App Store. So the end result was I paid $99 to get this app into the App Store, and I didn't make any money. So I'm a terrible malware author. But the other point, the actual point, is that their review process isn't as good as they say it is. So let's step back and compare the effort it would take to be a malware author for iOS versus, say, like a Windows desktop machine. Not to pick on Windows, because the same thing would be true of Macs, but just we see more in the Windows world. So if I want to get a malware onto your Windows computer, I just have to get you somehow to download my executable and run it. There might be AV I have to get around. If I know what AV you have, I can certainly do that. And if I can accomplish those two things, I'm done. I'm there forever. You're never going to get rid of me. In iOS, I have to go through the trouble of getting an App Store account. I have to, unless I'm going to do the cheap way, I have to find a vulnerability, write an exploit for it, and build it into my app, which is a very risky thing to do as someone, right? If I've spent like 2 months working on this exploit and I send it to Apple, like if they find it, they're going to patch it, and then all that work goes for nothing. I have to get through the review process, and then any tools I download after that aren't going to survive reboot unless I have even more exploits built into it. And at any time, Apple might catch me and kick me out. So it's much harder to go after iOS, and the possibilities of failing are much higher. So, if you're a smart attacker, you're probably gonna, go after the desktops, I think. All right, so let's compare that to Android. So Android has a similar mechanisms. The biggest difference is they don't have the mandatory code signing. So they again, though, they have apps. Apps live in a sandbox. The biggest difference is the sandboxes you have to give them permission to do the things that they want to do. Only the first time, of course. But because they don't have code signing, I can have an app and it can ask for no permissions, and then it can download new code at runtime that does whatever it wants. It's still going to live in that sandbox, but think about the difference. So if I have an exploit in iOS, I have to build it into the app and give it to Apple. In Android, I can give Google an app that just downloads something that they don't know about, and then I can just have it download the exploit later. So in that case, Google never sees the exploit. The exploit only shows up on people's phones. So it's sort of scary that apps can just download code and run it when you compare it to iOS. The other difference is it's much easier to get in and around the Google Play Store. So it's cheaper, $25. You can also sort of register anonymously. So this picture comes from a talk that I gave with John Oberheide about how to do that and how to get around their automated method called Bouncer. So Bouncer is the Google tool that they run all the apps through to make sure they're not malicious. But we did some research that showed your app can tell whether it's in Bouncer or on a real phone, and so it can act very nice on Bouncer and it can act very mean on a real phone. But definitely Google has the ability to remove your app from the Play Store, and they can also remotely remove it from your phone, just like an antivirus. And they've done that before in the past. So again, you basically had two options if you want to be an Android malware author. The most common one that we see is you just make an app that asks for a bunch of permissions. Again, users are basically machines that click on yes. So they will do that, and then you win. The other option is you can actually have an exploit. So you can either ask for permissions or you can do it the cool way and exploit things. Again, it's easier than iOS, but it's still harder than, say, Windows. So if you want to attack Android, you have to get around Bouncer, which is pretty easy. You have to get some developer accounts. You have to either ask for permissions or download an exploit and exploit things, and then you're basically done. So I guess I should say, in the interest of fairness, that I was actually kicked out of the Google Play Store as well for that Bouncer research. I could go on you should grab me afterwards. I can tell you the story of getting kicked out of that. It was ridiculous. If you think, you could argue I did something wrong in Apple's case, but I really, really didn't do anything wrong in Google. They were just really being mean. So I talked to the Google guy afterwards. I was like, man, how come you kicked me out? I didn't do anything. And he said, oh, well, we have this very sophisticated algorithm that looks at users and what they do, and basically we associated you with someone else who was doing something bad, who is John Oberheide. And so we kicked you out because of that, not because of something you did. And I was like, that's reasonable. So let's talk about wrap up what I've said so far. So I have a PhD in math, which is like a high school degree here in Eastern Europe, but still, I know a little bit about math. So I wanted to really have some very rigorous data, and so this is it. So how hard is it to write malware for the different platforms? By now, hopefully you'll agree with me. Windows, easy. Android, harder. iOS, much harder. And so the instances of malware we see sort of correspond to that. And again, these numbers are very rigorous, and I got them from Miko earlier. They're greater, so tons and tons of malware for Windows, like every day there's new malware. Like there's like some for Android, like if you compare the number to the Windows, it's not big, but you might see them. And there's like a handful for iOS. And so it's not surprising that attackers aren't complete idiots. Like they're not going to beat themselves up when they don't have to. So they're gonna go after the easiest things for the most case. So here's some actual numbers from, this is from McAfee. So you can see here, these are the amount of malware over the years from 2004 till now. And the numbers are like in the range of like, 30,000 or something in a year. That's really not that much, right? When you compare it to Windows. And then what kind of malware is there? Well, the big blue thing on the pie chart here, this is again from McAfee, is Android. So Android is almost all mobile malware. And in fact, iOS doesn't even get a color. It's so small. So what about, so that's like malware. What about exploitation? Well, we don't really see that in the wild. Here's a graph that shows browser traffic and whether it's coming from a desktop or a mobile browser. And so you can see the blue bar is the desktop PCs browsers. And so it starts out like back in 2009, it was essentially 100% of all web traffic. And now it's like, I don't know, 85% or something like that, right? But still, like, if I'm a bad guy and I host a website and I want to attack browsers, 85% of the traffic is going to, if I write a mobile exploit, 85% of the traffic I can't touch. So it's like stupid to write a mobile exploit when I could write a desktop, browser exploit, and I will hit way more people. The other thing is, in the real life, what we really see is a lot of attacks against plugins like Java and Flash. But we don't have those on mobile browsers, and so it takes away a lot of the possibilities of what you can do. Also, it's, guys like me, who write browser exploits, it's fun to write those, but I never have to worry about actually getting you to click on my link. But real bad guys have to worry about that. And so one technique they use is, well, I can't get you to come to my bad website, so I'll just pay for an advertisement on a site that you actually go to. But if you look at, when you're surfing on your desktop, you get tons of ads everywhere, right? It's like you go to Facebook, who, they have banners here, like everything is just an advertisement basically. But like on your mobile browser, you don't really see that so much. And so this is like a graph that shows how much it costs to buy an ad for a browser, for a desktop browser or a mobile browser. And the mobile browser, it costs way less because people just don't really even see those. They don't click on them and stuff like that. This is just a graph to show that it's harder to get people with their mobile browser to come to your website. But of course, I've been talking about how hard it is, but it's not impossible. Things happen. I write exploits, so I know it's possible. But here's an actual iOS exploit that happened against an older iPhone, but it was an iPhone that essentially has all the same security that today's iPhone 5S would have. So this was written by a guy named Comics who came out of the woodworks as a young kid who's smarter than anyone in this room probably. Amazing guy. So this was jailbreakme.com 3. So basically the way it worked was there was a vulnerability in the web browser and the way it parsed particular fonts. And the thing that was special about this vulnerability was not only did it allow you to corrupt memory, it allowed you to read memory too. And so he was able to read memory, and that got around the randomization of memory because he knew where he was. Then he corrupted memory, and then he was running code, but he couldn't just run shellcode or anything. He had to use what's called return-oriented programming, which means he was just bouncing around inside the program itself. But he wasn't done. So then he had to exploit a bug in the kernel to turn off the code signing. So he had an exploit inside an exploit. Very difficult. And then once he got into the kernel, he turned off code signing, and then he downloaded his payload and actually ran it. The payload was just to jailbreak your phone, and so it wasn't bad. It was good. I went to that site, and people were jailbreaking their phones. It was awesome. But it would be very easy to change the payload to do something bad. So this is basically what an exploit would have to do to attack iOS. It's a lot of work. So if you want to compare the two, on desktops, there's like tons of browsers out there. They've got tons of crazy plugins. So there's going to be a lot of targets. You're still going to have to bypass exploit mitigations. There might be sandboxes if you're dealing with like Chrome or something. But then you're done, and you get to live forever. On mobile devices, it's hard to get people to your website. The attack surface is much smaller. Again, you have exploit mitigations and sandboxing. And then you have to persist. So in Android, you're pretty much done, but in iOS, you're going to have to like turn off code signing or something. So it's difficult, more difficult. But those people out there might be saying, but Charlie, it's true what you said, but phones have more attack surface than desktops, and that's why they're easy to attack. And I'm going to say bullshit. So there is, here's some things that you might find. So yes, you can send text messages. So that's more attack surface. You can attack baseband. That's more attack surface. You can attack NFC. That's more attack surface. So true, more attack surface, but like you just don't see this in real life. So I've written exploits for 2 of these 3, but there's probably only been a handful of exploits ever for SMS. I can think of 2. And I did 1 of them. And NFC, I can think of 2, and I've done 1 of them. Baseband, I can only think of 1 guy in the whole world who can actually write exploits for that, and it's not me. So we just don't see exploitation like that. So there is more attack surface, but it's not something that the attackers have figured out how to do yet. So just to like pound home my point more, like let's go to the real world and see what we've seen. So if you take something like black hole toolkit or something, that is a real thing that real bad guys use to attack real people. What kind of exploits are there? Well, you can look if you could read that, and it's all things like Java and Flash and stuff like that. But there's definitely no mobile exploits in that. What about Metasploit? There's tons of exploits in Metasploit, but there's really no mobile exploits in there, except this old iPhone 1 exploit that H.C. Moore wrote. So not going to work unless it's 2007, and it's not 2007. There was this like big Operation Aurora thing that happened. That was not a mobile exploit. That was like an Internet Explorer exploit. So have there been mobile exploits? Yes. So there's this guy there who had more hair than me. It's actually me with more hair. So I've written exploits. There was an exploit in 2012 at RSA. Pwn known, there's exploits every year. Jailbreak.com we talked about, but that's it. Like the exploits for mobile devices are all like pony shows, like things that researchers like me do to get in newspapers. But like bad guys don't do it. So even more compelling is to look at real attacks that have happened and the big ones. And there hasn't been a real big one in a while, which is good. But the last sort of round of big attacks, if you remember, at least in the United States, there was this attacker, and they attacked the New York Times, they attacked Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, so like they were attacking everyone. Oh, and then there was this little company called Twitter that got hacked too, but we're not going to talk about that. But a lot of these big companies, they got attacked, and it's like, well, how did that happen, right? And the way it happened was it was a web browser exploit, but it wasn't a mobile browser, right? So, if like mobile is this thing we're supposed to be so scared of and we're supposed to be spending all this money on, why haven't we seen a bunch of attacks that like the very first thing was a mobile attack? Because we just don't see those, they don't exist. So like, is there anything I should be worried about as a CIO or as a user? Well, yeah. So there's basically 2 issues that are real serious issues. And the first one is you have users, right? Life would be so much better if we didn't have users. Like I write code sometimes for Twitter, and man, if we didn't have users, my code would be like way better. But the users are always screwing it up. So the problem with users is they click on things, and also with phones, especially, they lose them. So the biggest issue with phones isn't that they're going to get exploited through a web browser or something. It's that they're going to lose their phone and they don't have a PIN code or something, and all their data is going to be gone. The other thing is that users will take their phones and do stupid things to them, like jailbreaking them. So jailbreaking does lots of things to your phone. It turns off some of your exploit mitigations. It allows you to download software from anywhere, of course, or at least not from Apple. The software you download through like Cydia, it doesn't run in a sandbox. It can run as root. Now it can. Before you couldn't download new code and run it dynamically. Now you can. There's more code, so there's more attack surface, and it can even break some things that like you're trying to manage the phone with. So it's bad, right? It's basically when you jailbreak your phone, you turn off all the security. So you don't want your users to do that. But in the Android world, the biggest problem is fragmentation, and people have talked about this a lot. The problem is, in this case, that I picked. I'm not picking on these three companies, but you basically got three people involved in updating your phone. You've got Google or whoever wrote the OS, you've got Samsung or whoever makes the actual device, and then you've got AT&T or whoever your carrier is. And they each have their hands in there, and all three of them have to agree whenever an update happens to your phone. And the problem is two of these groups don't really want you to upgrade. Two of these groups want you to buy a new phone. And make money off of that. So Google is really the only one in this group who wants you to actually update. So it's hard. Like Google has to update it, which they do very quickly, and then Samsung has to like integrate all their crappy Samsung code into it, and then AT&T has to integrate all their crappy code into it. And before long, it's been 6 months, or they just say, "I forget it. It's not worth it." An iPhone is a totally different story. iPhone, Apple runs the whole show. For better or worse, and then when they want to patch it, they can, and it's very easy. You can update over the air, and if you look at the data, it backs up the fact that iPhones are just way more up to date than your typical Android phone. So here's like, as time goes on, what versions of Android you see installed, and you can download this graph from Google for yourself. So here's some more numbers. So on the left is when various versions of Android came out. And on the right is like current adoption of those. So if you look, like only 36% of phones, or maybe if you count the other one, so like, I don't know, 45% of phones have 4.1 or newer. That came out like over a year ago, right? So in half the phones, Android phones in the world are more than a year old. And if you compare to iOS, so this is data I grabbed in August. I have newer data in the next slide. Like it's a different story. So iOS 6 came out about a year ago, and like 90-something% of phones are on that. If you look at like what the Apple fanboys do, as soon as a new version come out, man, they all download it and install it. So like here is iOS 7. It came out September 17th, and like 2 weeks later, it's at I don't know, 65% or something. So in 2 weeks, you're at 65% of iPhones are on the newest version of the operating system. If you look at like some actual malware that's been out there in the world, you can do the same comparison. So even when there's vulnerabilities and exploits, like in Android, it just doesn't get updated as fast. So what can you do? So you can't change the operating system the way it works unless you want to really change your phone a lot. You can't make the review processes better. You can't change the sandbox rules. You can't make ASLR better or something. You can't change things like what hardware encryption you have or anything like that. So there's not much you can do. What you can do, you might say like, well, our antivirus saved us from the desktop, so we'll use that on our phones too. But it doesn't really work on phones, right? Because the apps you download, they run in the sandbox, right? So they don't have the power that an antivirus on your desktop will have. You pretty much have to just hope that the phones work as they can. One thing you can do, of course, is MDM, and that's what most companies will do. But again, you're not going to protect from exploits as much as you're going to do things like make sure users have passcodes, which is, so you're protecting them from themselves. They have encryption, remote wipe, all that kind of stuff. But it's only going to be effective if the users aren't, trying to go out of their way to hurt you. So like everything, you have to ask yourself, who am I worried about, right? Like, are you worried about, so when you go to DEF CON and you're gonna not turn on your phone because you're too scared, like, who are you worried about? So are you worried about these guys? These are like your typical DEF CON attendees, who are trying to show off for their friends. they're going to show off in a way that's easy, right? They're not going to spend 9 months working on an exploit to show off to their friends. They're going to be like, look, I took over, Joe's computer or something. So they're going to go after like, the PCs because it's so much easier. What about your criminals? So these guys are people motivated by money. So they're going to do the thing that they can make the most money as quickly as possible. They already have a bunch of code written for PCs. So they're going to mostly focus on PCs because they have code, and it's easier, and it's more cost effective, right? So it doesn't make sense for them to retool everything just to go after a mobile device that's like 10 times harder. Like, they're not going to do that. What about like the AP tiers? So, and I don't mean the people who their company gets attacked and they're like, oh, it was super advanced and we couldn't have done anything to stop it. I mean like actual AP tiers, like the Chinese government or something. So they're going to go after you no matter what. If they think that your data is on the phone or they think that's the only way in, they're going to write a phone exploit and they're going to attack you. And so this is the only people who are really realistically going to be going after your mobile phone. And if they are going after you, like, you're pretty screwed. So there's not much you can do. But if the people you're scared about aren't the Chinese government, you can be pretty comfortable that your phone is pretty secure. So when it comes time to like, you're a CIO or you're a person and you don't have infinite money, you have to decide how to spend your money. What should you do? Well, what I'm going to say is like, don't completely ignore mobile. Like, you make sure that you have at least some insight into how your users are using it and that you have some control over things like passcodes and encryption, but don't blow your budget on it. Like, no one's ever really been attacked through mobile, no real companies. And so spend your money against the real attacks that we've really seen, and not on these theoretical attacks that people like me are getting in the newspaper for. So I say this now, but something might change, right? I reserve the right to completely change my mind and say that mobile is like for real scary and you should be scared. But what's going to change my mind to do that? Well, mobile systems aren't going to get easier to hack, and but what might happen is mobile systems are hard, PCs are easy. Like, this isn't going to get easier, but this might get harder. So if it becomes so much harder to attack PCs that it's essentially just as hard to attack a PC as a phone, then maybe people will start attacking phones. Also, if like all the good data ends up on phones and there's like no reason to even attack PCs, bad guys will go after it then too. But for now, this isn't the case. So to wrap things up, mobile attacks are certainly possible. Like, I've certainly written exploits, but in real life we don't really see them so much. If there is going to be a mobile attack, it's probably going to be against Android as opposed to iOS. If you do see one, it's probably part of like a very, very, very advanced attack as opposed to like some teenager. Attackers are smart. Well, most of them. Some of them are stupid, but a lot of them are smart, and they're going to go after the path of least resistance. And for now, that path is not mobile. Here's some slides at some other places to like learn more, and that's it. You guys have any questions? All right, well, I'll be around, so you can grab me if you have any questions later. Thanks for your time.